Hello, this is Helen Mottee, and I want to welcome you to For Eternity.
I put my heart in your hands and you taught me to fly.
Hebrews 13 verses 1 to 3 exhorts us to let brotherly love continue. Do not forget to entertain strangers, for by so doing some have unwittingly entertained angels. Remember the prisoners as if chained with them, those who are mistreated, since you yourselves are in the body also. Reading from justice.anglican.org. Several years ago, I heard an African clergyman born of pagan parents tell of his conversion. He said, "One afternoon I was bicycling along a road and met a young man, about my own age, bicycling in the opposite direction. He promptly turned about and began to ride beside me and to talk. He spoke with great enthusiasm about Jesus, whom I had never heard of before, and how he had destroyed the power of death and evil by dying and rising again, and how he was God become man to reconcile man with God. I heard what my companion had to say, and before we parted, I had accepted Jesus Christ as my Lord and Saviour. Now, the young man who preached the good news of Jesus Christ to me that afternoon had himself heard of Jesus for the first time that morning." In the previous edition of For Eternity, we journeyed to Uganda and gained an insight into the lives of our sisters and brothers living there, and the increasing persecution they face because of Islamic intolerance and its expression through intimidation, violence, and vigilante-type killing of those Muslims who have turned to Christ and begun to follow him, thereby, in the eyes of Islam, becoming apostate and worthy of death. We also learned of Uganda's recent history, the coming of missionaries in the 1870s, the first Christian martyrs at Namagongo, and the subsequent rapid and passionate spread of Christianity through this country, which again showed the truth of Tertullian's statement, "The blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church." We glimpsed the horror of life under the tyranny of Idi Amin, and we saw the rise of persecution of Christian believers by the adherents of Islam. But there is another story that I believe needs to be told and heard from the heart of Uganda. The story of Australian grandmother Irene Gleeson and her love for and commitment to the children of northern Uganda over 2 long decades of violence, displacement and terror wreaked by Joseph Kony's Lord's Resistance Army. So, who is Joseph Kony? There is speculation as to whether he is in hiding or even still alive. Regardless, he and his rebel army are embedded in Uganda's recent history, and even though relative peace has returned to northern Uganda, untold thousands continue to live with the deep physical, emotional and psychological scars from that period. In May 2014, Al Jazeera posted the following article. We read, "The Lord's Resistance Army, or LRA, began life in 1988 in northern Uganda. It emerged from the remnants of the Holy Spirit Movement Army, founded by Alice Aoma Lakwena, a priestess and distant relative of Joseph Kony, the LRA leader. Kony, a former catechist, capitalised on a power vacuum created by the defeat of resistance movements in the north, some of which abandoned their military campaigns and made peace with the government in the 1990s to start the LRA. The group first operated as the United Holy Salvation Army before it was named the Uganda Christian Army or Movement and eventually the LRA. It adopted the name sometime in 1992. The LRA gained a reputation for brutality as it waged an armed rebellion seeking to remove the government of Yoweri Museveni, the Ugandan president, and rule the country on the biblical 10 Commandments. The vast majority of the LRA fighters came from the northern districts of Gulu, Kitgum and Pardur. Sustained government offensives have weakened the group's numbers. Most of the fighters were forcibly recruited into rebel ranks by fighters who often killed those who were reluctant to join the LRA or hacked off their ears, lips and limbs. Although the group has been basically a ragtag army that often resorted to banditry to survive, it took the Ugandan government nearly 2 decades to rein them in. After a series of defeats at the hands of the Ugandan military, the LRA sought sanctuary in the neighbouring Democratic Republic of Congo. There, according to Human Rights Watch senior researcher Annika van Woudenberg, they have become a, quote, regional problem spread between 3 countries, unquote, the DRC, Sudan and the Central African Republic. Part of the reason the Ugandan government had difficulty defeating the LRA was because of the military support they were allegedly receiving from the Sudanese government. Sudan says that Uganda supported the Sudanese People's Liberation Army, which fought the Khartoum government for decades until they signed a peace deal in January 2005. Women and children have borne the brunt of the LRA. In 1996, the LRA raided a girls' school and herded scores of students off into the bushes. Some of the students died in captivity while others were later freed. Female abductees were often forced to become wives of the rebels, and some contracted AIDS from their husbands. The government struggled to protect villagers from the LRA, eventually setting up what is called protected villages to house internally displaced people. Although the camps were within the Army's areas of operation, the LRA occasionally attacked the IDP camps and massacred civilians. In 2005, the International Criminal Court in The Hague indicted Kony along with several of his senior commanders for war crimes and crimes against humanity. The indictment was a sticking point in negotiations, which began in 2006, brokered by the Southern Sudan government between the LRA and the Ugandan government to try to end the conflict peacefully. The LRA wanted their leaders to be tried by Ugandan courts, but the ICC has maintained that once the arrest warrants are issued, they cannot be taken back. The court also doubted the independence of Ugandan courts and their ability to deliver justice of the kind that meets international standards. Kony never turned up for the talks, often sending representatives to the talks. The talks collapsed in 2008 after the LRA and the government accused each other of violating the terms of the ceasefire agreement. By this time, the LRA did not have any more bases in Uganda, and the rebels were holed up in the jungles of the DRC. In December 2008, a major offensive was launched against Kony by a joint force of Ugandan, Rwandan and Congolese troops, but he escaped and remains at large. Since 2008, the LRA has killed more than 2,400 people and abducted more than 3,400, according to the US State Department. The UN estimates that over 380,000 people are displaced across CAR, the DRC and South Sudan as a result of LRA activity. In 2009, US President Barack Obama signed into law the Lord's Resistance Army Disarmament and Northern Uganda Recovery Act, legislation aimed at stopping Joseph Kony and the LRA. A year later, in November, Obama delivered the strategy to disarm Kony and the LRA. On October 2011, the US President announced that he would deploy 100 combat-equipped advisors to Uganda to help efforts against the LRA. The US also offered bounties of up to $5 million each for Kony and some of his top LRA aides in April 2013. Uganda troops captured 19 LRA rebels in CAR in December 2013, which was considered to be a sizable victory in the hunt for members of the notorious group. The Pentagon announced in March that it would send 4 aircraft and the 150 troops needed to maintain them to hunt for Kony in South Sudan, CAR, Uganda and the DRC. I'd like to play you part of an interview I found on Journeyman Pictures, which was produced by Sam Farmer, in which the journalist was able to meet with Joseph Kony in June 2006 in a jungle location arranged by Kony's aides. The question posed to us is this: is Joseph Kony a brutal child abductor and mutilator, or the Christian freedom fighter he claims to be?
After 2 days of travelling by road, a potential meeting place is found. We wait. And then, out of the jungle, Lord's Resistance Army soldiers.
I talk with him until come.
Their leader, Joseph Kony's number 2, Vincent Oti.
Hello.
Yes. Oh.
You see? Hey.
Okay. How are you?
Good.
Fine?
How many security would you want us to take?
Few.
So we can go?
Yeah.
So,
Let's.
security.
SPLA remains behind.
As we walked through the bush, I finally believed I was going to meet Joseph Kony. And there he was, the man I'd been chasing for a year, the man who's eluded the Ugandan government for 20 years. Of the handful of images of Kony, the most famous is of a man in his 20s with dreadlocks. He's now in his 40s, but his hatred of the Ugandan president Yoweri Museveni hasn't changed.
You are the first journalist to come to me in the bush like this. So when I am here, you have now seen me. I'm a human being like you. I'm also, I have eye, I have brain, I wear clothes also.
Describe yourself to me. Tell me who you are.
I'm a military position who is fighting in Uganda. I'm a freedom fighter who is fighting for freedom in Uganda. But I'm not a terrorist.
But the manner used to achieve these political aims has been horrific. Thousands of child fighters and civilians have been slaughtered. Hacking off lips, ears and limbs are just some of the methods used by this ruthless rebel group.
You have been accused of terrible crimes. You know, people having their ears cut off, people having their lips cut out.
Yes. That one is not true. That is propaganda which Museveni made.
I've seen the photos of people with no lips.
Yes. That is propaganda which Museveni made. Let me tell you clear. That thing was happening in Uganda. Museveni went in the village and he cut the ear of the people, telling to the people that thing was done by LRA, which is not true. I cannot cut the ear of my brother. I cannot kill the eye of my brother. I cannot kill my brother. That is not true.
Are you saying that the LRA have never been involved in any abductions, any mutilations, any rapes?
Yes.
They've never been involved?
LRA has never been involved on that one.
Most of Kony's fighters have been with him since childhood, since the time they were abducted from villages in northern Uganda. War is the only life they've known. Kony has been accused of kidnapping, indoctrinating and imprisoning tens of thousands of children in his army. While I was there, I didn't see any young children, but some told me they were 15.
I did not abduct anybody there. Some civilians, they volunteer themselves to come and join me so that we stay together to protect their life, to defend themselves here. Do you think that the children can afford that condition of war? They will not. You see, that is propaganda which Museveni is playing. I don't have any children here.
But that's not the line he later takes with his troops. If I were president, all children would carry a gun, he tells them. To me, fighting is as normal as ironing a shirt.
8, 9, 10 provinces.
20 years of war have involved atrocities on both sides, the LRA and the Ugandan government.
Show me the place where we are now.
It's a different map.
In a war fought mainly in the bush, out of sight of cameras, the truth is hard to establish.
Not feel happy, definitely.
Riek Machar has taken on the role of bringing both sides together for peace talks. But as with previous attempts, it's going to be extremely complicated.
So we meet tomorrow.
I'm still unclear exactly what are your objectives? What are your aims? What are you really fighting for?
We want the people of Uganda to be free. We want the people of Uganda, let me say it inside that we are fighting for democracy. We want people to be with total democracy, free. We should be free to elect our leader. We want our leader to be elected leader, but not a movement like the one of Museveni. Sam, come.
Let me film a little bit longer.
As we ate together, it struck me that Africa's most wanted man, who's never been interviewed by a journalist, seemed guilt-free, more interested in the record of other war criminals.
I've seen here the former president of Liberia.
Joseph Kony and 4 of his most senior commanders are the first people to have arrest warrants issued by the International Criminal Court.
So that you will record where?
Kony alone is accused of 33 counts of war crimes and crimes against humanity.
I'm not guilty. I'm not guilty. At this time, it is very difficult to do. But when we talk this peace talk, and that peace talk, when we talk and everything is finished well, we go and talk.
Okay. We'll see you tomorrow. Okay.
We go and judge that case to show that I'm not found guilty. Yes.
See, this is the emblem of the Lord's Resistance Army. In the middle of the heart is the 10th commandment of God. We are fighting to defend the 10th commandment of God because people are not following the 10th commandment of God.
Coney is accused of controlling his forces with a mixture of distorted Christianity and brutality. Their ideology, they say, comes from the Bible.
Has God told you to fight this war?
No. It's not like that. God did not tell me to fight this war, no.
How many spirits speak to you?
Very many. I don't know the number. But they speak to me, they talk to me. You know, we are guerrilla, we are rebel, we don't have medicine. But with the help of spirit, they will tell to us, you, Mr. Joseph, go and take this thing and that thing.
Joseph Coney has been elusive for so many years that he's achieved an almost mythical status, both among his supporters and his enemies. The fact that he allowed me to spend time with him may be significant. He may be preparing to come out of the jungle and engage in talks with the Ugandan government. But it wouldn't surprise me if he slipped back into the bush, never to be seen again.
In the interview we just heard, Coney describes himself as a freedom fighter, not a terrorist. He states that he and his army have never abducted children, nor have ever mutilated or killed anyone. He believes he is fighting for Uganda's democracy and the liberty of her people. Reading now excerpts from a graphic interview posted by Will Storr in the UK's The Telegraph in February 2014. When I meet him in the village in which he grew up, Norman Okello leads me to a quiet space beneath 2 mango trees, far enough away that his mother and father and children won't hear the stories he'll tell. We're in the north of Uganda, and the scene around us is of a kind of pastoral paradise. Huts of earth and thatch, the green shoots of sweet potatoes in the dark earth, hills in the distance. It's hard to imagine this place as it was on January 1st, 1994, with a Ugandan army helicopter flying low, AK-47s firing, and the Lord's Resistance Army somewhere out there whispering among the tall grasses. On that day, Norman was 12, which was around the age at which the LRA liked to recruit its fighters. Led by the warlord Joseph Coney, the LRA's child soldiers were notorious for their acts of creative evil. Local leaders would be warned of reporting their location to the Ugandan army by having their lips speared and padlocked. Individuals caught riding bicycles, an act forbidden by Coney, would have their legs and buttocks cut off. People would be forced to torture one another. Norman spent 2 years fighting with the LRA. He saw these things. His abduction took place as he was sneaking back from the family rice field with his father. 5 soldiers surrounded them wearing stolen Ugandan army uniforms, their telltale dreadlocks betraying their true identity. "Is this man your father?" one of them asked. "No, sir," said Norman. The soldier raised a large stick. "Is it your father? Tell me." "It is not my father." I asked Norman why he denied this. "Because if I accept, they would make me kill him." The LRA often forced recruits to murder their parents so that they'd have no family to escape to. Somehow, though, Norman convinced them of his lie. His father was led away. They took Norman to a commandant named Ojara. "We're going to write your name," he said. Norman expected Ojara to produce a pen. Instead, 4 teenagers beat him with large sticks. He was told, "If you scream, we will kill you." Recalling the pain, Norman shakes his head. "It was beyond," he says. "My face swelled up, my eyes bled. By the end, you could not recognize me." From a distance, Norman's father watched in tears as his boy passed out. Bloody, deformed, and still in his school shorts, Norman was led away. I totally lost any hope of anything, he says. Around 2 months into his abduction, Norman was forced to kill. The victim looked 18 and was an LRA veteran of about 4 years who'd attempted escape. More than 300 new recruits were being marched, starving, dry-mouthed and exhausted, to the LRA base over Uganda's northern border. As they gathered around, a commander instructed the newcomers to step forward and select a weapon. Some picked clubs, some picked machetes, some picked an axe, says Norman. Me, I picked a bayonet. They queued up, each boy beating and cutting the soldier. When Norman reached him, he was only half alive. He lifted his bayonet and pushed it into his chest. With a gurgle, the boy died. When you kill for the first time, automatically you change, says Norman. Out of being innocent, you've now become guilty. You feel like you're becoming part of them, part of the rebels. The psychological damage was severe. The first person to hear Norman's story was Theo Hollander, a researcher at the National Memory and Peace Documentation Centre, a Christian aid partner organisation that records the experiences of people in the 19-year conflict. As many as 38,000 young soldiers are estimated to have been abducted and forced to fight for the LRA. Many, like Norman, took years to recover sufficiently well that they could lead a normal life. His experience, although appalling, is relatively ordinary. The LRA's recipe for making killers of children had 3 ingredients. First, they must abandon all hope of returning home. Next, they must be blooded by the act of a murder. Finally, through superstition and ritual, their new persona is inflated with its own sense of esteem. Underpinning all this, though, there's a final constant: rage. Rage at their own taking, at their beatings and starvation, at the atrocities they're witnessing, at the crimes they're now committing. More than anything else, when recounting, Norman talks of his own possession, not by the spirits, but by the Furies. Whenever I saw anything, it was not with a good heart. All my mind was full of destruction. The worst atrocities during Norman's time with the LRA took place during what's now known as the Kitcombe massacres. They told us that the elders of Kitcombe were picking weapons and informing the government, and they had to be taught an unforgettable lesson. They moved through the villages of the region, slaughtering all those who hadn't fled. The human beings who are around you, they have to be killed. People were lined up and stabbed with bayonets, using stones on their heads of the weak ones. A mother was instructed to eat her son and was beaten to death with a padlock when she refused. Toddlers were tossed into burning buildings. The heads of the disabled were staved in with the butts of rifles. 2 young boys were told to beat each other to death with sticks while soldiers cheered them on. The Kitcombe massacres took Norman back to Uganda, which reignited his longing for home. He took his chance to escape soon afterwards, eventually turning himself into Ugandan soldiers who transferred him to a treatment centre in Gulu. Word reached his mother that Norman was back. His head was swollen and bald from the heavy loads he'd had to carry on it. He had severe conjunctivitis. His stomach was bloated with hunger. She didn't recognise him. He had to beg, "It's me, your son." Before he was taken, Norman's father remembers him as a respectful child who worked hard at school and prayed a lot. When he returned, he'd become someone else. He'd beat other children, at one point kicking his sister almost to the fire, at another sending a cousin to hospital. "The way I behave, it was very rough, even to my parents," says Norman. "Sometimes even my plan was about killing them." Years of therapy involved the rebuilding of his personality by the repetition of one simple message: it wasn't your fault. The counsellors always said, "You leave what you've done in the bush," he says. A form of group therapy involving play with other young survivors of abduction was also helpful. When you play football with your friends, the former child soldiers, you say, "I think destructive things. What about you? How do you feel?" They say, "Even me, I feel the same. And for sure, you feel very good." Today, Norman is a happily married father of 2. I'm normal now. I'm just another member of the community, but the nightmare is there. I dream about someone coming to abduct me. Before we leave the quiet of the mango trees, Norman tells me he fears Coney's return. Along with his diminished but still active LRA, the warlord is believed to be in the Central African Republic. Does Norman believe the evil presences are still with him? He nods. The spirit is still there.
Wengi pamoja. Muziki ni lugha ya ulimwengu, kengele inayowakutanisha wengi pamoja. Pamoja.
Before introducing you to Irene Gleeson and her work among the children of northern Uganda, I'd like to read excerpts from Mark Ellison's article posted on aljazeera.com May 2015, titled "The Girls of the Lord's Resistance Army." We read, "Thanks to the infamous Coney 2012 campaign, you probably now know that the LRA abducted more than 30,000 children from their Ugandan homes in a conflict that spanned 2 decades. You will have heard how these boys and girls, some as young as 6, were beaten, raped and forced to loot and kill. A childhood interrupted, a childhood lost. But having worked with more than 40 female former child soldiers since 2011, I can tell you that is not the whole story. More than a quarter, approximately 8,000 of these abductees were young girls like Betty. Contrary to the popularised image of the child soldier as a teenage boy gripping a Kalashnikov, female abductees also fought in the conflict, sometimes running into battle with their babies strapped to their backs. But the biggest misconception surrounding Ugandan child soldiers is that their struggles ended when they were able to escape the LRA. Although the guns have been silent in Uganda for more than half a decade, many female former child soldiers have been unable to reintegrate fully into their communities, often returning home HIV positive and bearing the physical and mental scars of conflict. They face stigma and poverty. Here are some of their stories. At the end of our hour-long interview, Rose Acheyo motions to me that she wants to show me something. The former child soldier pulls down the front of her dress to reveal a series of dark scars that mark her chest. She says members of the LRA cut her with a bayonet when she dropped a heavy load of rice she had been carrying for many miles. Rose is a 3-time victim, torn away from her home by the LRA rebels, forced to be a wife in the bush, and now stigmatised by her community and even her family upon return. My husband did not want me as a wife again when I came home, says Rose. He would tell me the rebels had already slept with me, so I was now a rebel wife. He blamed me, saying that I was responsible for my abduction because I always made myself smart and wanted to look beautiful. The 42-year-old says she is now by herself. I can't even farm my own little plot of land now because of the chest pain I now have from my wounds, she says. I'm just doing my best to try and survive. Agnes Okello still bears machete scars on her shoulder and abdomen. The impatient spirits don't wait until night to haunt Agnes Okello. They come for her as she sweeps her compound under a blistering Ugandan sun. The presence of the spirits, or Sen in the Luo dialect, triggers flashbacks to her 5 years with the LRA. One moment she's approached by a dreadlocked soldier who handcuffs her with a coarse rope. The next she shoots a fleeing man through the chest. Then she caves in the head of a baby. Her body begins to shake and her heart races. When she comes round, she crawls into the shade of her hut, curls into a fetal ball, and prays herself to sleep. Agnes's story is fairly typical of those abducted by the LRA. She was taken by the rebel army in 1999 when she was just 18, witnessing the murder of her father and brother before being forced to march for miles carrying heavy luggage. Anyone who complained was beaten or killed. 15 years on, she still bears machete scars on her shoulder and abdomen where she was hacked at with a punga for dropping a load she was carrying. She says she was only made to be a wife, but over the course of our conversation, she hints at being forced to kill. Government forces finally rescued her in 2005, but she still suffers from PTSD today. Betty Ejang was 13 years old when she was abducted. She was one of Joseph Kony's wives for 4 years before finally escaping. Some of us were ordered to help kill my friend who was overheard talking about escaping, she explains. We were asked to each pick a different part of her body, like the arm. Then they gave us machetes and told us to cut it into pieces. I really cried because she was my friend, but if I had refused, they would have killed me. It is into these horrific circumstances that Aussie grandmother Irene Gleeson willingly entered and laid down her life for the thousands of children who had suffered through and after this 20-year conflict. And let's remember that not all the atrocities, mutilations and displacement were caused by the LRA. Ugandan government forces also contributed to this nightmare, and as always, it's the people, especially the women and children, who suffered in such unimaginable ways. I was privileged to meet Mama Irene in Sydney some years ago at a special fundraiser evening organised for her work in northern Uganda. I remember her as a small, humble woman filled with a consuming love for the thousands of children her foundation had rescued out of the conflict raging there for over 2 decades. During that time, I was also able to meet and talk with a young man, David Livingston, who had been abducted by the LRA as a boy and who had managed to escape and seek refuge with the Ugandan army. David was now one of Irene's right-hand co-workers and also ran a Christian radio station that was reaching millions of Ugandans with the message of the gospel. Mama Irene died in Sydney in August 2013 after a long battle with cancer. In April 2012, the ABC's 1+1 aired the following interview with Irene, which was recorded in her home in Kitgum, Uganda.
Irene Gleeson, welcome to 1+1. Can I just ask, how did you get from the northern beaches of Sydney to here in northern Uganda? What brought you here?
It was a big sacrifice to give up my home and my children and grandchildren, so I wanted to go somewhere where it would make a big difference. Then I heard about the rebels of North Uganda who were abducting the children, and that's when I decided, all right, that's where I should go. And I sold my house and I caught the bus to the furthest point north in Uganda, and that was Kitgum. I got out, and here I've been ever since.
There must have been times that you're in your caravan under a tree in the bush with a war going on around you that you had to wonder, what am I doing here?
I have a lot of courage. I was born into a very difficult family without a father, and then my mother dying. So from the earliest age, I've had to fend for myself a lot.
The rebels came a number of times. I know that they came and tried to attack in your caravan. Tell me about one of those times.
I came here with my husband, and he was my second husband. He was not as strong as me, and as life got very difficult here, he needed a rest in Kampala. So he went and had a rest there, and he met an African woman and divorced me and married her. So I was left totally alone up here at 50 years old, just in my caravan with nothing, no money, and just surrounded by thousands of destitute children and very, very ferocious rebels. So I read in the Bible that God is my husband. So I claimed that, and okay, God, if you're saying it, you be my husband. So I wrote above my bed in fluorescent chalk, "My beloved is mine, and I am his." And I'd often lay there in bed lonely and just reading those words on the ceiling. "My beloved is mine, and I am his." And they gave me a lot of comfort. Well, one night at 2 a.m. I heard keys in the door, and I looked out the little window, and there were 20 fully armed thugs dressed in khaki. Don't know where they were from, but they had cartridges. It looked like a Rambo movie. They had pangers, they had machetes, bayonets, guns. There were about 20 of them. So I screamed, and then all their rifle butts, they started smashing the windows of the caravan, and then their boots were kicking in the door, and then they pulled the door off its hinges, little aluminium door meant for a beach, a beach caravan, pulled it off its hinges, threw it aside, and then 20 of them just jammed in and shoved me on the bed. And I just laid there with my heart pounding. I thought, now tonight, definitely, I can't get out of this. But as I looked at their faces, above their faces was those words of God, "My beloved is mine, and I am his." And a great courage came on me, and I sat up and virtually pushed them like that. And I said, "I belong to God. Don't you touch me. If you touch me, God will get you." And they just jumped off away like I'd hit them with a blowtorch.
To an outsider, it's quite extraordinary. It would make most people dissolve in a puddle, want to go home. What kept you here?
I could say two things. The call of God. God had got me here. How else does a person sell their beach house in Sydney? It has to be God, or else they have to be insane. So it was God that made me go through the motions of putting the home up for sale and then putting all the proceeds into this place. And it's also, I don't give up. I will die with my boots on. I don't give up. And I had thousands of children that were beginning to be dependent on me for food, for medicine, for schooling, and nobody else was here. It had to be me. And I love the children, and I still love them. I'm amazed at their courage. Their courage can make you weep.
What did you think about the Joseph Kony 2012 video? You've seen it now. What did you think of it?
For me, you have to mop up after war. Rehabilitation is more important than putting posters. A lot of the local people say, if we catch him, what then? The children are still, the whole society is devastated after 26 years of war. There's no food for them, there's no medicine, there's no education. So that's what we have to put our money into and our energy. And that's what I do. I build full daycare schools. We're just building another new one, our 5th one, in a rural area full of destitute children with no education. So there the children will go every day, they'll have water. We've already put 2 water bores on. Then they'll have breakfast, they'll have lunch, there'll be a clinic, they'll have medicine, then they have education, and then they'll have vocational training. This stops child trafficking, which always moves in after war.
Many people hope that in their life they could make a difference. Do you think you've made a difference?
Definitely. There were, in our care right at this moment, between 8,000 and 10,000 children. And many, they graduate every year. Probably 500 graduate every year. So if you do that over 20 years, it's thousands of children that we've given an opportunity to.
You talk about the tough times. What was the toughest?
Oh, wow. I think isolation, especially after my husband left. Isolation and the fear and being surrounded by thousands of destitute children who were unable to give. And I can remember going through a period of thinking, nobody cares about me. Nobody cares about me. And it was the truth. They couldn't care. They were flat out surviving themselves. That's why I've got a very strong faith now. I have the sense that God loves me and God smiles on me. And that's a great comfort to me. But more than that, you know, I was born as a reject child. I was a child of an American soldier in 1944. And he left and went back to the USA when my mother was pregnant. So that was a terrible embarrassment. In Australia, you were not supposed to have children to the Allied forces. You were supposed to wait for the boys to come home from fighting in Britain. And so people used to spit on me, call me a bastard. I learnt that very early when I was 4, that I was a bastard. But I somehow kept going and struggled. I got my diploma for teaching when I was 35 years old. And so my thing is to get a rubbish can kid, someone that the world thinks there's nothing, no potential, and you just give them a chance. You give them the basics first, food, medicine, water, shelter, and then you give them education and then vocational.
You've raised the first generation here after the war. You're now onto your second generation. What next for you?
I'm interested in the women's hospital. Here in Uganda, 16 women a day die in maternity-related deaths. There is no prenatal care. No one knows when the baby's due. So sometimes a woman can be a month overdue and nobody even knows because she hasn't been to any prenatal care. So I can't wait to see all these lovely bouncing babies being born.
Irene Gleeson, thank you very much for talking to 1+1.
Oh, Ginny, thank you for travelling all these bumpy miles to the north of Uganda into this terrible heat and dust. Thank you.
Reading from sbs.com.au, posted August 26, 2013. Australian aid worker Irene Gleeson dedicated more than 20 years of her life to helping an estimated 6,000 orphans in Uganda, many of whom had been abducted by Joseph Kony's Lord's Resistance Army. The 68-year-old died in Sydney last week after a 14-month battle with cancer. To thousands of Ugandan children, she was known simply as Mama Irene. One of those children spoke at her funeral in Sydney. Mama Irene is a true hero. She picked me off the street when my own father said, "I don't know you," said survivor George Lubiga, known by his rapper stage name, Exodus. "I lived on the street and life is only worthwhile today because of her," he said in his tribute. During her time in Uganda, Ms. Gleeson established 3 schools which feed, educate and provide medicine for thousands of Ugandan children. She also helped to build an aid hospice, a vocational college, a community church and a radio station that broadcasts to more than 1 million people in the region. Her Christian-based Irene Gleeson Foundation now supports 8,000 children through 450 working staff supported by funds from Australian and American donors. Ms. Gleeson told Ugandan newspaper New Vision in late 2012 that she was motivated by a strong desire to address the imbalances between Australian and Ugandan children. "My children and grandchildren had whatever they wanted, but this was not the case with African or Ugandan children. Being a Christian, I chose to redress the imbalance," Ms. Gleeson told New Vision. Irene Gleeson Foundation Director Jean-Paul Kifasi says the story of Miss Gleeson's life is inspirational. She gave away her children's inheritance, sold her home in Sydney and came into a war zone to set up a caravan in the bush. She first gathered 50 kids under a mango tree and fed them, clothed them and educated them, he told Fairfax Media. 20 years later, we now have had more than 20,000 gone through these doors. The first 50 are now managers at our 4 schools. 1 became a doctor and 4 are nurses. Foreign Affairs Minister Bob Carr sent a tribute on behalf of the Australian people and government. He said, "Her life charted an inspirational path from Sydney to Kitcombe. Mama Irene demonstrates the difference that one dedicated and courageous human being can make in the lives of many others. She leaves an enduring and remarkable legacy, not only helping thousands of children who attended the schools she established, but their families and wider communities. She was committed to helping build hope and new dreams in the aftermath of conflict." Gleeson leaves behind 4 children and 15 grandchildren. Are you inspired? You may not be called to sell everything you possess and move into a war zone in Africa to look after thousands of orphaned or abandoned children, but we are all called to take up our cross, lay down our lives and live as pilgrims and sojourners on this earth, faithful to our Saviour and Lord and his teachings, and serving our neighbour just where we are. Please remember our brothers and sisters in Uganda and all who sacrificially served there for the sake of the gospel. I'd like to leave you with a song I wrote and recorded several years ago about child soldiers. Until next week, this is Helen Mottee for eternity.
Make some porridge, make some cake, make a child soldier. Make some porridge, make some cake, make a child soldier.
Take a boy of 7, take a boy alive, give him an AK-47, tell him if he's to survive, he must kill his baby brother, shoot his mom and dad, so then he'll be a real man and not just a village lad. We'll make some porridge, we'll make some cake, we'll make some porridge, we'll make some cake. Take a girl of 7, take a girl alive, and she'll march with this army till she's fit to be a bride. Wait till she's 11, maybe wait till she's 13, then give her to a soldier, no one will hear her scream. We'll make some porridge, we'll make some cake, we'll make a child soldier, teach him how to hate. We'll make some porridge, we'll make some tea, we'll make a child soldier, take him on a killing spree. See a world tormented, see a world that's free, see the 8% who have it all, hey you know that's me. See political necessity, see economic gain, 300,000 child soldiers who do not have a name. We'll make some porridge, we'll make some cake, we'll make a child soldier, teach him how to hate. We'll make some porridge, we'll make some tea, we'll make a child soldier, take him on a killing spree. See a world tormented and see a world that's free, see the 8% who have it all, you know that's me. See political chess play birthed upon a gun, 300,000 child soldiers who have nowhere to run.
We'll make some porridge, we'll make some cake,
We'll make a child soldier, teach him how to hate.
we'll make some porridge, we'll make some tea,
We'll make a child soldier, take him on a killing spree.
we'll make some porridge, we'll make some cake,
We'll make a child soldier, teach him how to hate.
we'll make some porridge, we'll make some tea,
We'll make a child soldier, take him
Sudan, Colombia, Belfast, Burma, Afghanistan, Sri Lanka, Lebanon, East Timor, Iran, Angola, Israel, Iraq, Uzbekistan.
For Eternity is produced in the studios of Rima FM Port Macquarie.